1, 2, 3.
My name is Joe Austin and welcome to this edition of Scéalta. I am delighted that Scéalta is a joint production of False Affairs to Hear and Phobail. I want to thank the James Connolly Centre, RSG Connolly, for facilitating the interview. My guest this evening is someone more known for his analytical views on politics, for his decisive insight as to what's going on in the society that we have inherited, created or lived in. He's Eamon Mallie. He's an award-winning journalist, he's an author, he's a broadcaster of course, internationally known, and he also is someone who has a passion, you may be surprised, for poetry and for art. Eamon, thank you, and I know you're exceedingly busy, so thank you for being here.
Tá mé intach buig tíad as an coro a hurtú in yif can an agalú shahiano lat.
Got a minute. I want to begin, and this may surprise some people. You know that people in pubs would try to define where your accent's from, where you come from, what part of the world. And you are, of course, a South Armagh man. And I read recently a description about that period in South Armagh where you lived. So tell me just, where in South Armagh are you from?
Joe, there was an old Shanachie in Donegal, and I listened to him for many years in Ranafirst, called Neddy Frank. And he always started his narrative with the following refrain. Once upon a time, a Fimacul was out hunting and a great shower of rain came. It was fiction, but I thought it was a great refrain or introduction for a journalist to talk fiction. I'm not talking fiction, but we were reared in the shadow of Slieve Gullion. Now, Slieve Gullion was a great weather vane in our house in South Armagh. We were born and reared in a townland called Legmyland, and it looked on to Slieve Gullion, and it looked on to my grandparents' house, the other side of the Cullywater River. But each morning when we were heading out to school, my mum would look across the valley towards Slieve Gullion, and if there was a so-called cap on Slieve Gullion, a mist, she'd say, "Children, take your coats, it's going to rain. There's a cap on Slieve Gullion." So Slieve Gullion, the mountain, within whose ring we live in South Armagh, was so important to us. And in many ways, I suspect that mountain and the hollow and the valley dictated how we speak, because we were right on the edge of the border. We were just 2 miles, roughly a mile and a half away from the border. So we were border children. And that's where the whole whaling and dealing came into our lives. And when we were children, such was smuggling in those days that we lived on a big long laneway, but we knew by the sound of the lorries on the roads who was actually smuggling at that moment in time. But the sound of the old lorries, we recognised those lorries. Those are such and such, such and such. That was life there.
I said you have we're going to hopefully encourage you to read a few poems for us. But I said you had a love of poetry. You have a love of language. You have a love of words. Does that come from a rural setting? Does it come from maybe it's a myth that people outside of the city engage and talk and have more to say and more skirting around in the art of conversation?
Well, you see, you got to realise I come from an environment where up until 1970 my parents didn't have a TV.
The tilly lamp years.
The tilly lamp years. I was educated. I did all my reading as a student under the tilly lamp. And that's why I call my collection of poetry Under the Tilly Lamp. And the final line of that particular poem is, if it hadn't been for that old tilly lamp, from where would I have got my light? Not to talk about my enlightenment. Because that tilly lamp was the source of energy which provided the light and provided a context in which I could study. And the Tilly lamp was very important to us. We didn't have a television, as I said, when I left home going to university in 1970. We lived on the side of a hill down a big long lane, and we had no electricity, no running water through the house, with plenty of running water down the walls, but not piped through the house. So it was a very isolated area with a wonderful neighbourhood, and conversation was everything. Cailling was a way of life, and people visited each other's house. So there was always conversation taking place. Radio Luxembourg, that would have been the soundtrack in terms of music at night. Our neighbours, young girls, Kitty McShane, Rosaline and Maisie, they used to pile into our house when my dad was away working in England, places like that.
Michael?
And Michael Mallie was my dad. And Mickey, he was known locally as Mickey Mallie. If somebody came into the neighbourhood and said, where does Michael Mallie live? A Doleman or something like that. Because my dad used to do the double. And it's very interesting the way you see the world. I was embarrassed because my dad was doing the double. Most of the time, if my dad wasn't in England or working in Belfast, he was unemployed. And he would get the odd day in the countryside with a farmer. And the Dolemen would have been out around the country tracking people like my father. Now, my parents sent us to grammar school in Newry to educate us. Mom was driven by education. Her big thing was, read. I don't care what you read. If it's only the Beano and the Dandy, read. That was her thing. Education, education. And she drove me on and gave us I recall when she bought the Oxford Dictionary Encyclopedia, I think with 21 guineas paid over 21 months. And some of the neighbours said, who the hell does she think she is? But she was a very smart woman. She, when she was 16, she was entered for an exam by Mrs. Muckin, Nellie Muckin, and she burnt the papers. And she lamented that, I think, all her life.
By 23, she had 6 children.
That's right.
In a rural area with no electricity, no running water.
Yeah, my father in England a lot of time, working in Belfast.
Your mother obviously had a great impact on you, and I've read different interviews you'd given about her.
Yeah, she's
your hero in many ways.
Yeah, she had, yes. But then, and life moves on, and in I suppose around 1971, I met a Galway girl. Her eyes were black, and her hair was black and her eyes were blue. What could a fella do? And there's that was completely new influence on my life, and that brought me into the world of Galway and the folklore and the tradition. And her father was a fascinating man because he was a very substantial farmer, but he was very professorial in disposition. He should have been a professor. He was a wonderful historian. He was an authority in World War II, and he was unbelievably knowledgeable about the so-called economic war, which was the war between Ireland, De Valera's war with Britain. When it came to the economy, De Valera stopped exporting calves to Britain, and of course they were farmers. And he used to tell me that many a time he went to the market with 3 calves in the trailer and he came home with 5, because there was no market for them. And poor farmers couldn't afford to bring the calves home, so they tipped them into some man's trailer. So quite often he would come home with 5 calves, having gone with 3 that didn't sell. So I got a wonderful insight into life in the west of Ireland through my wife, and through her and through her family. Again, that oral tradition was enriched, because her mother used to say, he took to the drink and signs by. This was an expression. In other words, he started drinking and everything went to hell. But the idiom was, and signs by. The father spoke half Gaelic, half English. He'd say, has Droghol Amshel today. It's a Droghol Amshel today, bad old weather today, So Dad brought so much into my life by way of exposing me to a new way of thinking, culturally, and in so many ways,
Can I ask you, it's clear, and you mentioned your mother and her advice about education, and I suspect it's prevailed with you to this very day, to learn new things, to develop new ideas. How did this country boy fit into the big university city? Were you lonely? Were you able for it? Were you just hypnotized by the books?
I was so excited about learning. Like, I was interested in every bloody thing when I was growing up. Like, I remember learning about the Nigerian Prime Minister who was assassinated in 1963, I think, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Bulawayo. Now, why would I have bothered to learn how to say that name, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Bulawayo? But it wasn't necessarily education in the formal sense that enriched my life. I have a brother who's a joiner, and he'd walk in here, he'd walk into any gathering, and he would just lift the room with his one-liners. He comes out with the most extraordinary idioms, straight from the road, straight from the street. Like, I was with him one day and he said, somebody was annoying him. He said, Eamon, you see yon boy needs to blow over a dead cat. Now, can you imagine anything more repugnant than getting hit with a blow of a dead cat? And if somebody might be a mean boy, and he says, see yon boy, Eamon, he'd live in one ear and rent the other. He'd live in one ear and rent the other.
Yeah.
And those expressions fall from his lips.
Of course, yeah.
So naturally, but they're right from the street. And I was talking to Paddy Keelty, I was interviewing Paddy Keelty, the comedian, and Paddy was telling me he was down home in Drummoness and he met this old farmer. And Paddy was on the radio and he was on television, and there were articles in the paper about, it was a time when he was very popular, when he was very voguish at the time. And this old boy says, hey, see you young Kilty, he said, you're like cow shite on the road, everywhere I go you're there. We see how the richness, the symbolism,
very descriptive,
the metaphors, and you see that's right out of J.B. Keane and Paddy Kavanagh and the great Irish writers, because they captured the very essence of the spoken language. Aristotle said a very prudent thing, as one would expect. He said, in life, the preferable philosophy is to think like a wise man, but to express oneself in the language of the common people. Think like a wise man, to express yourself in the language of the common people. Isn't that wonderful?
It is, of course, and that's really what it's all about. And when I first encountered you, you were reporting on Downtown Radio, and you had that very distinct voice. So I knew you before I knew your voice before I knew you, as they say, in those bad days, which we're never going back to. I said earlier on that you're intolerant of bad manners and bad vocabulary and all of that. Do you still thirst for language? Do you still go after language?
I love Michael Longley. I just love his company. He's a fantastic man. I learned so much from him. He was in Rome for a few days and I met him when he came back. And he said, Eamon, he said, Rome is truly purgatorial. Isn't that a wonderful expression? And I think poetry is purgatorial. It's cleansing. It cleans you. It just refreshes you in how you see the world, or how another poet or a poet sees the world. I think poetry is purgatorial. I actually disagree with Joyce.
You disagree with Joyce?
Joyce is a bit cynical about poetry. But yeah, on this issue, I disagree with him.
Joyce is a bit cynical about life, but poetry is one part of it. I said I'm going to avoid the politics of your life, which have dominated so much of you and people's understanding of you. You have a book that's coming out later this year.
Well, maybe next year.
Oh, maybe next year now. Well, I'm putting in our booking for an interview. But what I would like to do, I'd like to ask you to read a poem. But before you do, I want to ask you a question not about that specific poem. A young boy living clinging to a mountain, tilly lamp life, and playing in fields and hunting with his dog and doing all of that.
You've done your research, Joe.
Thank you. Was it inevitable that you were going to be an artist of some description? You know, I'm just trying to imagine what you saw and what you heard and how you took it on.
Well, I love the riverbank. That's where I was to be found. If I was missing from the house, I was away with the dog, chasing pheasants, foxes, rabbits, or I was on the riverbank.
Daydreaming.
Oh, I loved it. I like the first lines I ever learned of a poem were, "Dark brown is the river, golden is the sand, it flows along forever with trees on either hand." And Robert Louis Stevenson.
Yeah,
I love that. But you know, life is not a straight line. You know, in recent time we saw and witnessed the passing of Christopher Stalford, a young man, 39 years of age. You know, and I'd written a brief poem about 2 years ago, and in the wake of Christopher's death, whom I knew and with whom I had a difference, and thank God, I humbled myself and told him I would forget about what he said to me.
Right, okay.
And do you know something? It's a great feeling. It's a great feeling that I forgave him his outburst against me. And anyhow, as against the backdrop of his death, I put this little poem up on Twitter, and it seems to have caught a mood. And I wrote it about 2 years ago, and it's called "If I Die Tonight." Oh, that a prayer wave would envelop my earthliness tonight when I close my eyes. And oh, that I be carried off to the republic of unconsciousness, where ugliness is unborn, where talk of war is a foreign tongue, where greed and lust are still born, and where grace will be my only neighbour.
Yeah, and that's really nice, I have to say. Yeah.
And I don't think we can expect or ask for anything more than that. The other interesting thing, Joe, in my formative years as a young guy, the church was relevant, very relevant to us. And I'm not one of those iconoclasts who dumps the church and has rejected the church. There are many manifestations of the Catholic Church which I don't like. But I'm at a stage in my life where my salvation is important to me. I have no reticence in saying I've become more prayerful. But the language of the church has travelled with me, you know. I love the language of the church, you know. Angus Day, Ki Tullus Becathmundi, Donna Nobis Pacem. You know, Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. I love that. And Gloria in Excelsis, what a beautiful idiom. Glory be to God, you know. So language is always important.
Is it the sound or the meaning or both?
A combination. But I love the sounds. And funny enough, Seamus Heaney said later in life, and he's quoted in a book where he distanced himself in the traditional sense of the Catholic Church. But the one thing he couldn't ever get away from was the sound of the words, which he learned as a boy in terms of the prayers in Latin and English. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Like, it's pure poetry, that. It's pure poetry. So sources, there are many sources for poetry, and the source can be the street or it can be the university, and they're equally relevant.
Are you critical of your own poetry?
Yes.
Yes, as in very critical, or
yes
as in...
Yes, I am, because I spend my life trying to find the appropriate words all the time to conjure up the very quintessence of a subject. And quite often those words escape me. But accidents happen. I came out of the house one day, and there's a gate just down from us, and it was wide open. And it's the first time I'd ever seen the gate opened. And suddenly I thought, God, I think there's a hinge there for a poem. And it was around the time that the Taliban entered Kabul.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, my God, you know. So I developed it then, and I talked about the cattle getting in and wrecking the lawn. The gate was left open. That was the refrain.
Yeah.
Because the gate was left open. And then my last line was, the Taliban marched into Kabul because the gate was left open. Because there'd been an abdication of responsibility. And the gate was left open in Kabul, and the Taliban marched in, and look where we are today.
It's often, I think, wrongfully suspected that poetry is the property of the wealth, the arty, or the well-to-do. And you mentioned your brother, and I know your family are very close, and I know you go to the metropolis of Newry every year, and you get together.
Oh, it's big.
And you do all the stories, and you embarrass each other, and you enjoy it. But poetry, in the way that you describe it, can be found and is found everywhere.
Everywhere. Paddy Kavanagh, my favourite poet in the world, of all poets I've ever read, Paddy Kavanagh from Enniskeane, just up the road from where we were. I didn't ever meet Kavanagh, but Paddy Kavanagh said his world was at the back door. That's the great realisation.
Yeah.
That my great old friend, whose biography I did, Basil Blackshaw, the artist, he told me he could sit in the corner for 3 months and not an idea would enter his head. He had no vision. Nothing would work for him in terms of a vision of a painting. And he said, I could get up from the chair thinking, and I'd walk into the bloody door, and suddenly an idea for a painting would emerge. But there's a certain dishonesty as well with every creative spirit, you know. Brian Friel and Basil were very friendly. Brian Friel, the playwright.
Yeah.
And Brian's wife and he and Basil and Helen, his partner, used to meet fairly regularly. And Friel would say to Basil, are you doing any painting, Basil? No, Brian, nothing happening. Nothing happening. No vision. Are you doing any writing, Brian? No. The well's dry. Both of them liars.
Yeah, of course.
Both of them working away. I tell a great anecdote which Basil told me. Friel was under pressure from his wife to get Basil to paint him. So you got to remember Basil, that Friel is the dramatist, the writer, and his wife is his loyal partner. So Basil has painted and painted and painted this portrait, and he reaches a point where he tells Brian, I think this, as far as I've gone with this, I think I'm nearly there, Basil. The next time you're coming up, Brian, will you bring Anne up and let her have a look at it, and we'll see where we go. So Anne and Brian arrive up, you see, and Basil always told his subject to look out across the lake while he mounted the portrait or the painting on the easel. So then he told them to turn around, and the painting was on the easel, and she looked and looked and looked at the painting, total silence, and Basil started moving around and said, Jesus, this isn't looking great. So anyhow, she still looked. Now remember, Friel is a dramatist, but it's his wife now who's creating the tension on stage. So eventually, Basil said, I'm in trouble here. So he said to her, well, what do you think, Anne? Silence again. The audience is puzzled. Then she lifts her head, looks at the painting, she said, it's awful, she said. Basil said, Jesus, I'm in trouble. Pause. She looked at it again. She said, it's just like him. But
it's too late.
But it was a sense of drama.
Of course.
Her capacity. And that's the great capacity to surprise.
When you're not working, of course, and I mentioned the poetry, and we're going to have hopefully some more examples of it in a moment, but you like art. And do you see art everywhere, or is it a specialised type of art, or how do you discover it?
I would drive to Coleraine if I were coming home from Dublin, and I was told that there was a great painting somewhere in Coleraine. I would drive via Coleraine
just to look at it.
To look at it. That's the passion. That's the craziness. Like, I have a great friend who's a great collector, and he said, you know, Eamon, he said, I could be in a room with 100 people, but if I knew some person in that room who was interested in art, the other 99 or 98
Wouldn't
people
matter.
wouldn't matter. I just want to talk to that person.
But
The religion.
again, the perception of art is the property of the wealthy and the well-to-do. So this is a boy from South Armagh, lived in a house clinging to a
But
mountain.
Joe, hold on. We were exposed to
No,
the fine things
but-
in life. We had a triptych of John F. Kennedy, the Pope, and De Valera.
Oh, no,
On
no.
a wall, a print.
What I'm going to suggest, let me indulge me just for a change. So, your father's a great man. He's a family man. He's a joiner. During your school holidays, you're working on a building site filling
I
wheelbarrows.
was a hoodsman.
You were a hoodsman. Okay.
Not a hood, a hoodie.
Where does the art? Is it something that's
Accident.
within you? Is
My
it
life
something
has
that-
been there've been so many accidents in my life.
That's the question that I'm asking.
Yes. I'll tell you where the art was born. I had a wonderful professor for Spanish in Trinity College called Nigel Glendinning. He was an authority on 17th, 18th century Spanish art. He was married to the great biographer Victoria Glendinning, who did the biographies of the whole Fitzroy group, Virginia Woolf, the Stracys and all those people. And when he was teaching us literature, no matter what we were doing, he always talked about architecture, about the art of the day, the cartoons of the day. He was a very visionary lecturer, and he stimulated something in me, an interest in art. And then when I left college, of course, I had two beans, and an old guy came to our house one day. We were selling our first house, our second house, and this old guy came to the house purporting to be interested in buying the house. And as he walked around, he said, "You know paintings on the wall?" And I said, "That's right." I said, he said, "Would you buy a painting?" I said, "Listen, I'm trying to sell a house. I'm trying to buy a house. So I've got my priorities." But I said, when I get settled into the house, when we get a house, she'll give me a shout. And then he started bringing me to auctions. And I was learning very rapidly. I was starting to read voraciously about art. And very soon, he stopped telling me anything because the pupil was now emulating the teacher. And I did a series of programs on Downtown Radio, 6 programs, 6 artists, including Charlie Macaulay from the Glens of Antrim, Tom Carr, who was a Slade artist from South Belfast. He was a contemporary of F.E. McWilliam, the sculptor. And Cecil Maguire was another painter. And Taylor Carson from Donegal. Taylor Carson was originally from Belfast, but he and Maurice Wilkes, I also did an interview with Maurice Wilkes. Taylor Carson and Maurice Wilkes rode to Donegal on 2 bicycles to paint and to have a look around the countryside there. And Taylor met the hotelier's daughter, and he didn't come home.
It's dead.
He stayed there, and he married Ruby from the Downings, and they built the most magnificent house hanging out over the Atlantic there in Donegal. He's dead now, Taylor Carson. And he was a fascinating guy. He went back to America. He got some commissions during the war here from the Americans. And when the convoys were going back to America with the war brides aboard, these are soldiers, American soldiers who married local girls. He was invited to return on the boat or the ship to America to paint the war brides. So when he was in America, he did quite a few paintings of celebrated writers. So suddenly I became totally immersed in art, and I just became addicted. That's my weakness. I become passionate about everything in which I'm involved.
I'm going to ask you to read another poem, but that was the question that you just answered there before I got asked it. I asked someone the other day, a friend of yours, a fellow journalist, who I'm not going to name, how would he describe you? And he said he's passionate and he's a perfectionist, and boy is that trouble.
Yeah.
So is that a fair description?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now,
so
if you're talking about Derek Henderson is the only person.
I'm not talking about Derek
Henderson is the only person who actually abuses me when I'm helping him.
Well,
Can you work that one out now?
Well, let me
Is
tell
that
you.
very Irish?
Just so we can narrow it down, it wasn't him,
No,
but you're close to the
I
mark.
wouldn't believe Brian Rowan. Anyway, this poem here it was again an accident, and it gave me so much pleasure. The actual moment of the experience, only to have that moment shattered within 2 hours. is called Rory and Elan. My 4-year-old grandson Rory, in red t-shirt and blue shorts, raced out caught. Can you just read it again?
Yeah.
Rory and Elan. My 4-year-old grandson Rory, in red t-shirt and blue shorts, raced off calling out, "Catch me, Papa, catch me!" Perching himself upon a concrete deck, he crowed, "Den, den, den!" "You are cheating, that's not den," I protested. "You made that up. Get down on the grass and we'll agree den," I urged. Arcing his legs like a dipper, bobbing on a river rock, Rory dismissed me with a tilt of his head again, calling out, "Den, den, den!" All evening the image of Rory, red t-shirt, blue shorts, rested on my retina, my face wreathed in smiles. "Den, den, den!" issuing from my lips like an ancient prayer. News at 10. The body of 3-year-old Elan Curdy in red t-shirt and blue shorts, symbol of the refugee crisis, lay dead, washed up on a Turkish beach.
I remember it well. And I have to say that's very moving. And it's moving for anyone who happens to have the privilege of having young children at that, because it seems to be just such an identity.
It was just...
Let me let you catch your breath just for a second. Because I think that poem actually moved you a bit there. So,
it did.
Okay, so you're very proud of your children, of course, and your grandchildren. You describe your grandchildren as a pure delight.
Yeah.
I wish I could say that. Mine are a pure delight most times.
Nobody's perfect.
Not even grandfathers.
There's no perfect life. But only a grandparent knows what it's to be a grandparent. That's a truism, but it is a truism. It's a reality. No, I've been very rich, very enriched in life. But when I think of the things that I saw in life too, Joe, just scary stuff.
I promised you I wasn't going to ask you about the political experience that we've all came through, and sometimes some more than others. And I'm not really going to be specific about it, and I don't want any insights. But the horror of conflict has scarred us all.
Yeah.
When you were a young reporter, a young man, a young reporter, and these things were happening around you, where was your refuge? Was it in poetry? Was it in your partner? Was it in the family? How did you recover from the things that you were reporting?
It wasn't easy.
No.
But I'm not one of these people who exaggerates how awful it was, I was blessed in many ways. I didn't ever encounter any real nastiness being visited upon me, no matter where I was. I remember getting trapped on the Shillington Bridge going into Portadown during Drumcree. And there were hundreds of people on the bridge, angry loyalists. I just drove into these people. And momentarily I wondered, was I going to get lynched?
Yeah.
But I just spoke the language I would speak to my friends down at home. "Listen, lads," I said, "I'm trying to get through here. The Chief Constable's giving a press conference. Could you just move back?" "All right, Eamon." And so I think my capacity to relate to people, no matter whether it was the Shankill Road or wherever I was, and I think too my friendship with Paisley provided a lot of cover for me. There was one moment when I thought I was going to get killed, really get killed, and that was when Martin Galvin appeared in the 80s outside Connolly House. Yeah. And the police moved forward with the Land Rovers, and we were underneath the podium. And I genuinely thought that we were going to get crushed as journalists that day. And that's the day that young Sean Downs was shot dead, and Galvin escaped. So that was a very scary moment, and I had just purchased a downtown radio used car, and it was covered in the downtown livery, and the young cubs burned it in front of my eyes, and the police stood and watched it. But there was a sequel to that. About 2 years ago, I was going driving towards downtown radio out towards on the Unards Road. And there's a wonderful mural there on the wall with Van Morrison and the literary figures of Belfast and that. And I stopped to have a look at it, you know, and I was admiring it. It's so good. And there was this man coming towards me, and I said to him, "Sir, could you tell me, do you know anything about the background to this? Who did it or what?" He said, "Sorry, Eamon," he said, "wrong man. I come from the West." I said, "Well,"
Yeah.
and I said, "Yeah," he said, "I met you before." I said, "Where?" He said, "I was one of the boys who burnt your van."
Nothing personal.
One of the boys who burnt your van the day that Galvin turned up at Connolly House in West Belfast. Isn't the world a handkerchief?
And in East Belfast, yeah.
In East Belfast. And there's a lovely expression in Spanish which crystallizes the smallness of the world. And it goes like this. El mundo, the world, es un pañuelo, is a handkerchief. El mundo es un pañuelo. And that's how small it is. I remember heading for Greece one Christmas. Like, I was crazy, you know. Why was I going to Greece? Didn't know anything about Greece. I didn't know anybody in Greece. But I was riding the meat lorries in those days. And I got to Brussels. It was the year that there was a petrol strike. It must have been about 1973, I think, or 72 or 3. Got to Brussels. Couldn't get any truck heading south. So I decided I would go to Brussels. I ended up in Brussels, in some old doss house. I hadn't got much money. I went into this old room anyhow, and there were 2 bunk beds, and I decided I would take the top bunk, fearful that if some unwelcoming individual turned up, I could use my foot to drive to repulse whoever it might be. Now, I was no different to so many other people. When we were growing up as children, the so-called pack men used to come to our houses. These were Pakistanis selling colourful clothes, trying to persuade our poor mums to buy some of these beautiful colour that bring you luck, you know. And we were terrified of this man with a turban and big white beard. So we carried those prejudices, you know. So and I remember sometime prior to that, there was a young girl killed by somebody from Nigeria called Mahangi in a basement in Dublin, which caused great fear in Dublin at the time. So, you know, you have these prejudices, and this guy came into the room in which I was staying with clearly Algerian, Moroccans, hadn't a word of my language, and I was a little bit anxious because of an awful prejudice which had travelled with me. And the next thing, he took out a white sheet and he laid it down on the ground. And I naively thought, he's going to sacrifice me. And the poor fellow was preparing to pray. Mm. But that's next thing, an American kicked the door open. He gave us such a dunt, I can still smell his feet. So we got chatting, and he said to me, "From where do you come?" I said, "Well, I live actually in Northern Ireland." I said, "I only know one Irishman," he said. He said, "This is American." He said, "He comes from a place called Crossbeglen." I said, "What was his name?" "Jim Short," he said. "I met him at Oxford."
Yeah, the barman.
His nephew. So isn't it, that just proves again, el mundo es un pañuelo. The world is a handkerchief. It's such a small world.
I see you fiddling with another poem. So is that my cue to ask you to read?
I want to read this because I love children.
Percy French.
I love Percy French.
I love Percy French.
This is Pretendy Land. Oh, come little baby across the sea, come to Pretendy Land with me. There's jam for dinner and jam for tea, and sweeties come falling in showers, where you need not think before you speak, but gabble and chatter and yell and shriek, where lessons are only a minute a week, and playtime is hours and hours. Over the blanket billow, over the sheets of sand, when night comes down on counterpane town, we sail to Pretendy Land. Over the hills of pillow, by favouring breezes fanned, with the flag made fast to the bedpost mast, we sail to Pretendy Land, where fairies live in a lovely wood, not bad fairies, nor yet too good. We'll play with little Red Riding Hood, and also Little Boy Blue, where nobody's nasty and nobody's old, and nobody's ever good as gold. And though you never do what you're told, yet nobody's cross with you. Over the blanket billow, over the bolster strand, both eyes must close, ere my baby goes away to Pretendy Land. Over the hills of pillow, wandering hand in hand, not a sigh, not a sound, our baby has found her way to Pretendy Land. Wouldn't we all love?
Lovely.
Would we all love
Lovely.
to make our way to Pretendy Land?
You're very family-centred and clearly, and I'm looking at your eyes as you read poetry, and you're reading that for children, including your own children, but all children. So, and I listed some of the things that preoccupy your time now, in terms of, writing. You have a new book out whenever it comes out, in terms of the poetry, in terms of art, in terms of memoirs, in terms of the media company that you now have. Do you now, at this age of life, do you have time to catch your breath and enjoy your own children and your grandchildren?
Yeah, up to a point. But I have a terribly busy mind.
Is that through choice?
Yes, I suppose so.
Okay.
I'm a victim.
We're all victims, Eamon.
We're victims. I mean, to say like I'm not proud of the weight of responsibility which I visited upon Detta, my wife, rearing those children. Like, I often left the house, bomb, shooting. I remember Ballykelly. I was out of the house for 17 hours that day. Like, I got this notion into my head. I always regretted not doing voluntary service overseas, VSO, when I was a student. Always regretted that. My daughter Kira, she did, and she went to Mexico City through the universities, and she worked there with street kids sniffing glue. Dangerous environment in which to operate. But when the famine came in Ethiopia, I sought a sabbatical for 3 months from downtown to go to work
In Ethiopia.
Yeah. My wife had 2 children. We had 2 children at the time. And I got this crazy notion that I would go to Ethiopia. Now, Mengistu, who was the then dictator who replaced Haile Selassie, he wasn't going to allow a boy like me hanging around for 3 months. So I was only allowed in for 12 days. But it was an extraordinary experience. But like, I left Dad at home looking after those children whilst I took myself off to Ethiopia. And it was a wonderful experience going to Ethiopia. We were there on the Saturday, and Cardinal O'Fee, who was connected
Another
to
South Armagh?
Absolutely, one of our own, who was there to support Trocra and Concern and other organisations. But there was a lovely moment at the airport. We were all down at the airport to welcome him on the Tuesday, and he always carried his little satchel. He always had a little bag, it was his night bag, like a little satchel. And he always walked along swinging it. So he stepped off the plane and he looked across to where we were standing, and he came straight towards me. Being a South Armagh man, we stick together. And he said, Eamon, he said, remember, there are hundreds of people dying in the desert. Men, women and children with hunger, starvation. And the first thing O'Fee says to me is, Eamon, the good news I bring from Ireland is Armagh beat down on Sunday. Like, where in the world
Well,
would
Walter
you find
Mackin
that?
makes a quotation around that. And you know what, I'm sure, but just to remind you of it, it's the bog and the man. You know,
That's right.
you can take it. And I suspect when you scrape us all, men and women, we're all from that.
You know, yeah, before coming here today, Joe, I was thinking of great short stories I read, you know. And Friel wrote a wonderful short story about the Pac-Man who arrived at this very isolated area in Donegal. And there was this grandmother and her little grandson used to stay with her. He loved staying with her. There were just the 2 of them in the house. And she was a young woman, but a Pac-Man arrived, and it was an awful bloody night. And they were sleeping in the settled bed, only one room, and the fire burning here. So the Pac-Man showed her all these goodies, etc. But he was heading off, and she said to him, son, you can't go out that night. You just have to settle here for the night. Which was a very strange twist.
Of course.
She had no husband in the house with her. So the granny and the grandson got into the settled bed, turned away, and she told them, just you settle yourself down there in front of the fire. You're not going out that night. But the line Friel uses is a wonderful line. There were as cosy as 3 pet hens. It's not a wonderful line.
Yeah.
There were as cosy as 3 pet hens. What a wonderful rural. And I was thinking this morning as well, before coming here, about Liam O'Flaherty. He wrote a wonderful poem in Irish, Boss na Mo, and it was about a cow, and the cow lost its calf, stillborn calf. And it was custom and practice in the Aran Islands to throw the calf over the rocks to be consumed by the birds. It's nature going back to nature. Just as in our part of the country, the afterbirth of a cow which had calved was hung on the branches of the hedges.
For the birds to eat?
For the birds to eat, which would be deemed now very dangerous, but that was what was done in those days. But anyhow, this was just nature at work. They couldn't subdue the cow. The cow was demented, and the cow was hurtling around the field, absolutely crazy, because she had just lost her calf. And she kept looking over the cliff. And the men worked so hard to try and subdue her. And eventually the Banatee, the woman of the house, came out. And his last line of the story is, "Came as she a can." She stroked her forehead, and the last line was, "She too was a mother, wie she in a maher foster." She knew loss.
Yeah.
And her stroking the forehead of the cow transferred something of
Identity, sympathy.
So that's what great writing does.
Well, on that last great writing, we're out of time. I'm going to ask you just one last indulgement. Would you close the interview with a poem?
I will. My great favourite, as I told you, in terms of poets, is Patrick Kavanagh. He wrote the great poem, which was then sung to the air of the dawning of the day sung beautifully by our friend Luke Kelly, no longer with us. But my son and I were in Dublin one day, and my old acquaintance from Trinity College, Brendan Kennelly, who was a professor of English there, I played football with his brother Kevin. I didn't know Brendan that well in college. I would have seen him here and there. But after leaving university, I got to know him somewhat better. So we were driving past RT, and he was crossing the road, and I stopped and we gave him a lift into town, and introduced him to my son. And the following day we were passing Buswell's Hotel, and we met Brendan again. And he said immediately, "How are you today, Micheál?" he said to my son. Now my son was so impressed. He was a young man, but Kennelly remembered his name, Michael Micheál. Now, Kennelly was a great walker. He walked around Dublin non-stop, making observations, obviously gleaning ideas from everything that he saw. And he was down by Raglan Road, and he was singing about poor old Kavanagh, an unrequited love. He had thirsted and lusted after Hilda Moriarty, but she married Donogh Mallie, the Irish minister, a very distinguished minister who introduced free education in the Republic of Ireland. And Brendan Kennelly wrote a response poem to Raglan Road, to Kavanagh's Raglan Road. This is the poem. It's called Raglan Lane. In Raglan Lane, in the gentle rain, I saw dark love again. Beyond belief, beyond all grief, I felt the ancient pain. The joyful thrust of holy lust, I stretched on heaven's floor. One moment burned what the years had learned, and I was wild once more. The year's deep cries in her sad eyes became a source of light. The heavy gloom and sense of doom changed to pure delight. And as we walked in joy and talked, we knew one thing for sure, that love is blessed togetherness and loneliness is poor. Then I grew rich with every touch. We loved the whole night long. Her midnight hair on the pillow there became an angel's song. Her happy skin, beyond all sin, was heaven opened wide. But as the dawn came shyly on, I slept and she left my side. Why did she go? I'll never know. Nor will the gentle rain. Her up and go was a cruel blow. And yet I felt no pain, for I had known her body and soul in my own loving way. So I lay and thanked the God of love at the dawning of the day.
Eamon Mallie, Gora Mila Melga.
Na haba.